August 1943. The North Atlantic. Gray, endless, and cold enough to bite through steel. A German U-boat surfaces at dawn, its decks slick with salt and fear. The commander scans the horizon, listening for the hum that every submariner dreads, the faint throb of Allied patrol planes. But this morning, the sound comes from below, a dull mechanical echo rising from the depths, then silence. Seconds later, the ocean erupts. A hidden mine tears through the hull, splitting metal like paper, one explosion among hundreds now haunting the Atlantic sea floor. The oceans had turned into minefields. By 1942, the Atlantic Ocean was the most dangerous stretch of water on Earth. The Battle of the Atlantic had become a war within a war, one fought not for land, but for survival. Every convoy that left New York or Liverpool carried more than supplies. It carried the hopes of nations. And beneath them lurked Admiral Karl Donitz's gray wolves, German U-boats, hunting in coordinated packs, cutting lifelines between America and Europe. At first, the U-boats owned the night. Allied shipping losses mounted at a rate that seemed unstoppable. In a single 6-month span, nearly 4 million tons of merchant shipping went to the bottom. Tankers burned for days, oil slicks stretching across the sea. Crews were plucked from lifeboats, frostbitten and dazed. The Atlantic had become a graveyard for sailors and an open wound for Allied logistics. But even as the U-boats terrorized the seas, the Allies were adapting. New radar, code-breaking, and long-range aircraft began to close the gap. The once invisible hunters were now being hunted. Still, Dönitz had one advantage: geography. His submarines could always retreat to the relative safety of the Bay of Biscay and the French ports of Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. These heavily fortified U-boat pens were concrete citadels, immune to most Allied bombing. From there, the U-boats would strike again and again. The Allies realized that chasing submarines wasn't enough. The ocean itself needed to be turned against them. That's when the idea took root. If the U-boats couldn't be destroyed in port, their escape routes could be poisoned. Instead of hunting submarines one by one, the Allies would lace the waters they traveled with invisible killers. Mines. Thousands of them. Air-dropped, ship-laid, and timed to detonate at the right depth. It would become one of the most ambitious and secretive anti-submarine efforts of the war. And it began with a single, cold decision in Washington and London to weaponize the Atlantic itself. The plan took shape under the code name Operation Starvation, a strategy first tested in the Pacific, but rooted in an earlier idea from the Atlantic War: strategic mining. The concept was simple but ruthless. Instead of engaging the U-boats at sea, the Allies would mine the very arteries they used to reach it: the approaches to French ports, the narrow channels near Norway, the exit routes across the Bay of Biscay. American and British naval planners worked side by side, merging technological innovation with hard-earned experience. The U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ordnance developed magnetic and acoustic mines capable of detonating when a steel hull passed above them or when a submarine's propeller signature reached a specific frequency. The British Royal Air Force, masters of night navigation, supplied the precision bombers to drop them. Each mine was more than a weapon. It was a sensor, patient and silent. By mid-1943, mine warfare had evolved from a defensive tool into a strategic weapon. The U.S. Army Air Force's 8th Air Force began deploying B-17s and B-24s on specialized mine-laying missions. Flying low over black water, their bomb bays opened not for bombs but for hundreds of cylindrical mines, each dropped with a timer, ensuring it would sink quietly and arm itself hours later. These aircraft flew without fighter escort, relying on the darkness to shield them from flak and radar. Within weeks, the results began to show. German records reveal increasing losses not from depth charges or torpedoes, but from sudden unexplained explosions in supposedly safe waters. Submarines vanished without a trace. Shipping lanes that had once felt secure were now cursed with uncertainty. Even the U-boat commanders, once fearless in their escape through the Bay of Biscay, started to dread the invisible fields below. The ocean itself had turned hostile. For Donuts and his men, it wasn't just a tactical problem, it was psychological. Every ripple could be death, every sound a trigger. The sea had become the enemy's ally, and soon that fear would reach its breaking point, when one Allied operation would blanket the Atlantic with mines like never before. For the men inside a U-boat, fear was a physical thing. The air was thick with diesel fumes and sweat. Every vibration from the hull could mean disaster. Mines added a new kind of terror, unseen, unpredictable, impossible to fight. Veteran commanders who once trusted their instincts now felt powerless. The seafloor was turning into a trap, and no amount of skill or courage could change that. Sailors slept in shifts, listening to the constant hum of the hydrophones. One wrong course correction, one careless turn, and the pressure hull could be ripped open in an instant. Survival became a matter of luck. The U-boats had built their legend on mobility and surprise. But with minefields spreading across the Atlantic, the hunters were losing room to maneuver. They could no longer rise freely to periscope depth or hug the coast for safety. Every route was charted, mapped, and baited by Allied intelligence. Donuts's wolf packs began to thin, not because of direct battles, but because entire patrol zones became off-limits. The U-boat's greatest strength, stealth, was being undone by the one enemy it couldn't detect. In Washington and London, mine warfare wasn't about emotion. It was about mathematics. Analysts studied tide patterns, shipping lanes, and acoustic signatures to determine where a single mine could cripple maximum tonnage. The goal wasn't immediate destruction, but psychological paralysis. If a minefield could make the enemy believe an area was deadly, that was victory enough. Each new field forced the Germans to divert ships, expend fuel, and slow their convoys. The Allies were learning that fear was as effective as firepower. Flying at 500 feet in pitch darkness, Allied pilots earned their own silent reputation. Mine-laying missions were some of the most dangerous of the war. Anti-aircraft batteries guarded every coastal approach, and a single searchlight could mean death. Yet the air crews pressed on, often without the recognition given to bomber squadrons. Their payloads didn't explode on impact. Their work was invisible, their results delayed. But every successful drop tightened the noose around the U-boat fleet. By late 1943, these combined efforts began to bend the war beneath the waves. But technology, and not courage, would soon decide its fate. The Allied mine wasn't just a lump of explosives, it was an evolving machine. Early contact mines had given way to magnetic, acoustic, and even pressure-sensitive types, each more precise than the last. The MK6 and MK7 series could distinguish between ships by magnetic field strength or propeller noise. Some mines counted the number of vessels that passed before detonating, ensuring a target-rich kill. To the German Navy, this was nightmare fuel. They couldn't sweep what they couldn't find. Specialized minesweepers equipped with degaussing cables and noise generators tried to neutralize them. But every attempt cost time, ships, and men. The Allies had found a weapon that multiplied effort without firing a single shot. Inside Donuts's command at Carnival, panic spread quietly. Reports of disappeared boats flooded in, submarines that never returned or even sent a final signal. The Kriegsmarine tried to adapt with cautious navigation zones, protective nets, and new sweeping gear. But these measures only slowed operations. Worse, Allied intelligence through ultra-decrypts anticipated German responses and mined new areas accordingly. U-boat commanders were forced into riskier open waters, where Allied aircraft prowled day and night. Each mined route became a funnel leading straight into Allied patrol zones. Donuts's wolf packs were bleeding out before they even reached their hunting grounds. Mine warfare blurred the line between strategy and cruelty. The oceans were neutral terrain, shared by sailors of every flag. But as the war deepened, morality gave way to necessity. Even neutral and civilian vessels sometimes wandered into mined waters, victims of a strategy too vast to discriminate. Allied leaders justified it as the price of ending the U-boat menace, a choice between a few lost ships now or countless more later. It was the cold arithmetic of total war, unseen weapons for an unseen enemy. By early 1944, the cumulative effect of mine warfare was impossible to ignore. German shipyards were delivering fewer submarines, and those that launched faced rising loss rates before even reaching the Atlantic. The once bold U-boat fleet now crept through narrow corridors of cleared sea, constantly second-guessing its charts. Allied mining, combined with radar and sonar, had transformed the oceans from a hunting ground into a labyrinth of death. And then came the operation that broke the U-boat's back completely, the day the Atlantic itself became an Allied weapon. It began in April 1944. The Allied command launched one of the most audacious maritime operations of the war, a vast, coordinated mine-laying offensive stretching from the Bay of Biscay to the coasts of Norway. The mission's codename was Operation Maple in its European phase, though its intent echoed the Pacific's later Operation Starvation, to close every door through which the U-boats might escape. Night after night, swarms of RAF Bomber Command's No. 5 Group and U.S. Army Air Force's 8th Air Force took off from English airfields under cover of cloud. Lancaster bombers and B-24 Liberators carried mines in their bellies instead of bombs, each one armed with delayed fuses and magnetic sensors tuned for submarine hulls. The pilots called these missions gardening, and the mines their vegetables. But this garden would bear only death. The operation's scale was staggering. In a single month, more than 6,000 mines were sown across key U-boat routes, estuaries, channels, and approach lanes that once guaranteed safe passage. The Bay of Biscay, the critical exit for nearly all Atlantic patrols, became a death trap. Mines were dropped at varying depths to target both surface escorts and submerged submarines. Others were seeded in choke points, narrow straits where sonar and radar coverage overlapped perfectly. German radio intercepts recorded the growing panic. Patrols reported underwater detonations in previously cleared lanes. Minesweepers worked non-stop but couldn't keep up. The Allies had laid mines faster than the Germans could chart or remove them, and every attempt to sweep came under attack from Allied aircraft lying in wait. For the first time, Dönitz realized the strategic noose tightening around him. His once proud U-boat fleet was being forced to launch from ports hemmed in by invisible walls of explosives. The Atlantic, once his domain, was shrinking. By May 1944, the effect was unmistakable. U-boat losses in home waters spiked sharply. Entire patrols vanished before reporting enemy contact. The Kriegsmarine's rescue flotillas found only oil slicks and drifting wreckage, and as Allied planners intended, these losses came not from pitched battles, but from silence. The ocean itself had become the executioner, but the next phase would drive the message home. When the mines didn't just guard harbors but severed entire supply arteries across Europe. In June 1944, as Allied forces prepared for D-Day, the minefields became part of a larger orchestration, a strategy to strangle Germany's naval power before the first landing craft touched French sand. The same bombers that mined the Bay of Biscay now shifted north, lacing the approaches to the Seine, Loire, and Gironde estuaries, cutting off resupply routes to German coastal defenses. Each night, the sky over Western Europe flickered with the faint glow of bomber exhausts. But the most decisive blows happened in darkness over open water. Hundreds of mines sank silently into the channels that fed U-boat bases at Lorient, Brest, and Saint-Nazaire. Many were fitted with ship counters, a technology so advanced that the mines would ignore the first few vessels, detonating only after several had passed, ensuring maximum confusion and destruction. By the time Allied troops stormed Normandy, those minefields had already done their part. Dönitz's headquarters was in crisis. U-boats slated to attack the invasion fleet couldn't leave harbor. Their exit routes were either mined or under constant air patrol. The once formidable U-boat arm, the same force that had threatened to starve Britain into submission, was effectively bottled up. On June 10th, U-415 attempted to break through the mined approaches near Brest. She struck a mine within minutes of leaving port. The explosion ripped through her pressure hull and sent her limping back to harbor, crippled. That same week, U-971 was destroyed by a combination of air attack and mines while trying to escape into the Atlantic. Each loss further paralyzed Donitz's already depleted ranks. What made this phase devastating wasn't just the physical destruction, it was the illusion of control being shattered. German crews no longer trusted their charts, their instruments, or their commander's assurances. The sea, once a known element, had turned treacherous. Allied mining reports later showed that over half of the U-boat losses in mid-1944 occurred within mined or mined-adjacent zones. The effect was absolute. Ports sealed, morale crushed, operations halted. The very weapon that had brought the Third Reich to its early victories had now been neutralized, not by superior submarines or ships, but by patient, invisible weapons resting quietly beneath the waves. As the Allies advanced across France, the U-boats sat trapped behind their own defenses, watching the war pass them by. The aftermath would reveal just how completely the tide had turned. By late summer 1944, the Battle of the Atlantic had effectively been won, not with a single decisive battle, but through exhaustion, pressure, and fear. The mines had done their silent work. What radar, depth charges, and sonar began, the minefields finished. In the span of 3 months, U-boat operations fell to their lowest point since 1940. Out of the nearly 60 submarines dispatched from western France that spring, fewer than half returned. Many never sent a final message. Their commanders were simply listed as vermissed, missing. The Kriegsmarine tried to maintain morale with stories of new wonder weapons, but inside the U-boat pens, crews knew the truth. The Atlantic was lost. Mines didn't just destroy ships, and they dismantled momentum. Every mined harbor forced the Germans to reassign scarce resources. Minesweepers, divers, engineers. Each day spent clearing routes was a day lost to combat. Mines also cut off fuel shipments from occupied France to Germany's naval bases, choking the supply lines that fed the fleet. Donitz's headquarters reported a crisis of readiness. Boats sat idle for want of fuel, torpedoes, or safe exit channels. Meanwhile, the Allies refined the strategy further. The U.S. Navy's Operation Cork in June and Operation Maple in July extended minefields up to 100 miles off the coast, creating layered zones of denial. These weren't random patterns. They were mapped to force submarines into predictable corridors, where radar-equipped patrol aircraft and escort destroyers waited. The oceans had become a vast, invisible trap, orchestrated with mathematical precision. Even when mines failed to detonate, their mere presence reshaped the war. Merchant captains rerouted, German convoys slowed, and commanders hesitated before giving the order to dive. The psychological toll was as measurable as the physical one, a war of the mind as much as of machinery. By the fall of 1944, the U-boat menace had faded into history's shadow. But for the men who fought beneath the waves, the price was only beginning to show. When the Allies captured the French Atlantic ports in late 1944, they found a navy in ruins. Inside the massive concrete pens at Lorient and Saint-Nazaire, dozens of U-boats sat abandoned, some half-repaired, others stripped for parts. The walls were pitted from air raids, the harbors littered with debris, and below the surface the real evidence of defeat lay silent. Hundreds of wrecks resting in mined waters that no one dared to clear. German records recovered after the war confirmed the scale of the damage. From 1940 to 1943, the U-boats had sunk nearly 14 million tons of Allied shipping. In 1944 alone, that number dropped by more than 80%. The tables had turned completely. For every U-boat that managed to reach the open Atlantic, another never returned. Mines accounted for a growing share of those losses. By the final year of the war, Analysts estimated they were responsible for 1 in 4 U-boat sinkings in European waters. The psychological scars ran even deeper. Surviving U-boat crews spoke of the constant dread of the ticking ocean, the belief that the sea itself had become alive with traps. Veterans described the distinctive metallic hum of a magnetic mine detector as a sound they could never forget. For many, the war ended not in flames but in silence, watching the sea boil as a fellow boat vanished without trace. When Admiral Dönitz surrendered in May 1945, only a handful of operational submarines remained. The once proud U-Boot-Waffe, which had nearly brought Britain to starvation, was now little more than a ghost fleet. Allied engineers later estimated that more than 80,000 mines had been deployed across the Atlantic and European coastal waters, a tasse-de scale of warfare so vast it would take years to fully clear. The oceans that once belonged to the U-boats now belonged to no one. They had become graveyards, both for machines and for the men who believed they ruled the deep. And yet, even amid the wreckage, the story wasn't over. It had left a permanent mark on how nations thought about naval warfare itself. In the end, the defeat of the U-boats wasn't won by speed, firepower, or even bravery. It was won by patience, by men who understood that the sea could be turned into a weapon if they learned to think like it. The minefields of 1944 proved a quiet truth of modern warfare. Control doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it comes from denial, from making the enemy fear every unseen shadow, every unexplained ripple. What had begun as a desperate defensive measure evolved into a masterclass in strategic suffocation. For the sailors who lived through it, the memory lingered. The ocean, once a vast freedom, became a place of suspicion, a reminder that technology had stripped even nature of neutrality. Beneath its calm surface lay thousands of reminders that victory in war often comes at the price of turning the world itself into a battlefield. The German U-boats once ruled the Atlantic with confidence and precision. By war's end, they ruled only in memory, ghosts caught in the minefields of their own making, silent beneath the waves they once believed were theirs forever.